Have you ever felt that there are stories that are not just buried in the ground, but buried inside you? Sometimes when we look at ancient ruins, it's not just the land that seems to hold secrets. It is as if something silent whispers to our spirit, reminding us of an era that perhaps our rational memory has forgotten, but our soul still recognizes. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is exactly what you needed to hear. Imagine walking through a silent desert and suddenly realizing that the ground beneath your feet is not just sand, but a thin veil covering ancient doors, unlit corridors, temples that once pulsed like hearts. Now think of the excavations that never reach the newspapers, in discoveries that are recorded only in internal reports, in the ruins that are found and immediately closed, as if they were windows to a past that someone fears we can see. Why are certain structures revealed to the world while others are quickly hidden? What kind of truth could be so profound, so transformative, that it would require silence? When archaeologists find blocks cut with impossible precision, tunnels that do not appear on historical maps, artifacts that do not belong to the era in which they were found, are we just faced with coincidences? Or in front of fragments of a civilization so ancient that we call it a myth, just because we don't know where put it on the timelines? Each hidden ruin seems to carry the same question. What was there before it? What do we call the beginning? Maybe what we call ancient civilizations are just the first that we were able to record, not necessarily the first that existed. And as the dust rises over places that will never be fully explained, a feeling persists that we are at the gates of a story much bigger than we imagine. A story that is not lost, just waiting for someone to have it courage to dig it. What if the ruins of the forgotten era aren't that far away? When we talk about archaeological excavations, we usually imagine scientists illuminating ruins in the sun, brushes removing dust centimeter by centimeter, and discoveries celebrated in front of the cameras. But there is another side to this story, a side that happens far from any lens at unlikely times under temporary authorizations and in reports that disappear as quickly as they appear. And this is where our journey really begins, in the excavations carried out not to reveal to the world, but to maintain certain truths only between a few eyes. The first revelation comes when we understand that not every buried ruin was found by chance. Many are detected long before any official announcement, for underground radars, density sensors, and technologies that, in theory, have not yet should exist in archaeological collections. When one of these signs appears strongly unusual, showing perfect chambers, impossible rectangular corridors, or metallic structures in deep layers, excavations are no longer research and become containment. Something is discovered, and immediately surrounded. Emotionally, this awakens something curious in us. Why do certain places cause so much silence? Why are some scientists suddenly removed from projects they dedicated years? Science should embrace mysteries, not fear them. And yet when an excavation threatens to alter the accepted narrative too much, barriers arise invisible. It's as if history itself has guardians. And this idea stirs something ancestor within each one. The feeling that the world we know is just a delicate surface covering much deeper layers than we imagine. But there is another emotional movement here, internal doubt. Are we ready to deal with civilizations that defy recorded dates, with structures that look like belong to an unknown engineering, with brands that don't fit in no culture cataloged? The rational mind tries to explain, tries to adjust, tries to fit in. The soul, however, recognizes the echo of ancient ages. It's like hearing a distant song, coming from a forgotten time, calling us by names we no longer remember. And then comes the twist, the contradiction that no one openly admits. The more, the deeper one digs, the older the intelligence appears to be found. Instead of a linear, ascending, progressive humanity, we find the opposite. Layers that suggest advanced knowledge even before what we call antiquity. Tools that should not exist coexisting with primitive ceramics. Cuts from atomic precision alongside rustic walls, as if different eras had coexisted simultaneously, or as if remnants of a much older civilization had been reused by later cultures, unable to fully understand that they inherited. Synthesis begins to emerge here. Perhaps the past is not a line, but a circle. Perhaps there are cycles of forgetting and remembering, rise and fall, ages of light followed by long periods of silence. And if so, then these excavations carried out at hurries, hidden from the press, represent more than discoveries, represent reunions, a chance to remember something that all of humanity at some point chose, or was forced, to forget. If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here. And now, faced with these first layers of revelation, the question that pushes us to the next block. If we have already found ruins that do not fit into any known era, what exactly we are about to unearth in the depths that still remain untouched. With each new site excavated, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge, a pattern that does not belong to any catalogued civilization, but appears repeatedly, such as invisible signature of an era that the modern world still cannot name. None of that is officially declared, but it is enough to follow the fragmented reports of researchers suddenly turned off, or from local workers who swear they saw structures being covered soon after being discovered, to realize that we are facing something bigger, something that escapes conventional timelines, like an ancient memory insisting to return. The first revelation of this block comes with the realization that many deep ruins they were not built to be seen from the surface. They were erected as if the darkness was an essential part of the project. Underground chambers perfectly aligned with specific stars, corridors that amplify sounds as if they were instruments and symbols engraved in patterns that are so reminiscent of modern circuits as ancestral rituals. It is as if spirituality and science were at that time the same language, a language that we have forgotten today. Emotionally, this type of discovery causes silent estrangement. There is something within us that recognizes these patterns. It's like walking into a room you've never seen, but to feel that you have already been there in some old dream. Perhaps because certain structures speak not only to the intellect, but to the body, to the imagination, to the deepest part of perception, the one where we keep memories that are not necessarily personal. When the walls echo perfectly, when the angles respond to the sound like organisms alive, we are permeated by an inexplicable feeling of familiarity. How if we were rediscovering knowledge that was once ours? And then the inevitable human reflection arises. What if we were more advanced in the past? Then who are we today? Not in physical technology, but in perception, in consciousness, in relationship with the invisible world. Perhaps the true fall of ancient civilizations may have been material, but sensorial. A gradual loss of the ability to perceive what cannot be seen, of hearing what does not make a sound, of intuiting what has not been taught. These ruins seem to speak precisely of that period, an era where spirituality and science did not they competed, but completed each other like two halves of the same symbol. But here comes the turning point, the contrast, the dissonant note. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes that some of these structures were not destroyed by time, were sealed, deliberately closed, as if something needed to be protected or forgotten. Stone doors fitted with molecular precision, tunnels interrupted by layers of rock that do not belong to the local geology, entire rooms lined with minerals quickly solidified, as if someone was in a hurry to hide what was there inside. Time doesn't hide secrets like that. Human intention, or something beyond of the human, hides, and the emotional synthesis emerges softly, almost like an ancestral lament. Perhaps it is not the world that is trying to hide something from us. Maybe it's us who aren't yet prepared to remember, because remembering means admitting that we exist within cycles, and that before ours there was another, an entire era that flourished, fell, and was erased, not out of failure, but out of necessity. If something inside you pulses at these possibilities, keep going. The journey is just starting. And so we arrive at the hook that opens the next portal. If these are just the first layers sealed, what was so powerful or dangerous to demand that an entire era be buried under time itself? With each new layer removed, the feeling that we are facing something impossible disappears, intensifying. Not impossible in the sense of fantastic or exaggerated, but impossible for the dates we insist on assigning to the ruins. In sites scattered across the 5 continents, the same elements appear, perfect cuts, in rocks as hard as silence, walls polished like mirrors, fittings that resist time as if the time was not allowed to touch them. This is where and the first great revelation appears of this block. These works do not appear to have been made with common tools, but with an understanding of the matter that we have not yet recovered. Traditional scientific interpretation tries to explain these facts with arguments such as abrasion, prolonged friction, infinite patience, but just a single touch of these surfaces to realize that this explanation is not enough. Perfection here is not artisanal, is geometric. It's mathematics. It's almost vibrational, as if the ancients knew not just the material, but the intimate behavior of the particles that compose it. At some sites, the rock appears to have been shaped, not carved, as if it had been temporarily softened by some unknown process. A process that today we would call it impossible, but in the face of the evidence, it just becomes forgotten. On an emotional level, these discoveries provoke something profound in the human spirit, a mix of wonder and discomfort. Because if we accept that ancient civilizations possessed a type of knowledge that we have not yet recovered, we also need accepting that our timeline may just be a fragile attempt to organize what that we don't understand. We need to admit that history is not a straight staircase, but a maze, and that perhaps we are not at the top, but just around a bend. Momentary. This realization can be both liberating and unsettling. Liberating because it broadens our vision. Disturbing because it dismantles our certainties. Then comes the twist, subtle and powerful. These structures show no traces of experimentation, show mastery. They don't look like the works of a civilization in rise, but of a civilization at its peak. No attempts, no less versions refined. Everything is done with absolute precision from the first block. This suggests something disturbing to our modern mind. Perhaps these ruins do not belong to the cultures that inhabited them, but to much older cultures that were inherited and reused. How houses of an unknown people that served as homes for later people, unable to repeat the same feat. Emotional synthesis appears inevitable. We are faced with traces of an intelligence that precedes ours, not an extraterrestrial intelligence necessarily, but a form human, or parallel to human, whose perception of the world was much deeper than our current ability to understand. A humanity that related to the invisible, with sound, with light, with minerals, as if in continuous dialogue with the very structure of reality. A humanity that knew things that we forget. If something inside you vibrates at this possibility, listen. The recognition that feels may not be imagination, it could be memory. And now, I leave a hook that leads to the next step of this revelation. If these impossible works represent the culmination of a lost science, what kind of spiritual knowledge accompanied this technology, and what would have taken was so advanced that it disappeared so completely, leaving only monuments that we don't know how to rebuild? As we advance towards the deeper layers of these ruins impossible, a new element begins to appear, not in the old stones, but in the modern behaviors. Reports stopped, authorizations revoked, archaeological sites closed without explanation. The silence of institutions, more than an obstacle, becomes a revelation in itself. Because when science finds something it doesn't know explain, you should investigate. But when she finds something she's afraid to explain, she shuts up. And this silence is the first great revelation of this block. Not every secret is old. Some are carefully constructed in the present. The emotional interpretation of this reality is disconcerting. Why would there be so much fear in recognizing that forgotten civilizations existed before ours? Why admit would a deeper, more complex, more mysterious past be so threatening? Maybe because in accepting that there were previous ages of great knowledge, we are forced to question the myth of continuous progress, the myth that we are inevitably the pinnacle of human history. This myth sustains systems, institutions, national pride, and even academic careers. If it collapses, many pillars that support it will collapse together. The modern world. And then we come to human reflection, the one that touches the viewer directly. How many there have been times in our own lives that something has been hidden from us because someone thought that the truth would be too much. This pattern repeats itself on different scales. Inwardly, in the collective, in history, we are taught to believe that we cannot handle certain realities, that we need filtered, simplified, diluted versions. Perhaps, therefore, when we realize that the story was shaped to be palatable, we feel at the same time indignation and familiarity, We've seen this movement before. We know how to recognize it. That's when the turn comes, and it does not come from institutions, but from ruins. Because the sealed doors found in excavations around the world are not sealed by the time. They are sealed by intention, by choice. Some of them have fittings for accuracy so extreme that modern researchers can only describe them as out-of-season engineering. Others are hidden behind layers of rock that they were clearly put there by human hands, not nature. There are tunnels that end abruptly in walls too smooth to be natural, as if someone had erased the path with a gesture. When we encounter this type of barrier over and over again, across different continents and cultures, the question is no longer, how was it done, and becomes, why hide? The emotional synthesis of this discovery is profound. Perhaps humanity has not lost just knowledge. Perhaps she was protected from it, not for punishment, but for mercy. Like a child separated from something he cannot yet understand. Maybe certain doors can only be opened when the collective consciousness is ready to integrate not just the technical knowledge, but the spiritual meaning that comes with it. Because all ancient technology seemed to be born out of a vision of the world, not a tool. And every tool seemed to be an extension of an inner perception. If something in you contracts and expands at the same time as you hear this, no, it is normal. We are touching layers of memory that don't just belong to the mind but to the soul. And so we arrive at the hook that leads us to the next block. If there are sealed doors that no one wants to open, what exactly lies behind of them? And what impact would this discovery have on the way we understand our origin and our destination? As researchers advance through narrow corridors, collapsed chambers and tunnels that seem to breathe with silence itself, a new kind of revelation emerges. A revelation that does not depend only on what you see but on what you feel. Many archaeologists describe the same experience, even if they are reluctant to record it formally. The feeling that certain ruins were not made just to be inhabited, but to be read. As if they carry a language that doesn't belong to no known alphabet, but capable of speaking directly to the body. This is the first revelation of this block. Before writing, there was architecture, that thought. The emotional interpretation of this discovery is disturbing and beautiful at the same time. In several places, circular chambers amplify the voice at frequencies that resonate in the chest, as if the structure were returning something beyond sound, something close to a feeling. Angled corridors transform footsteps into rhythmic echoes, as if invite the visitor to an interior rhythm. Niches lit only by cracks millimeters seem to pulse like stone breaths. All this indicates that these constructions were not passive, they were interactive. Designed not only to shelter but to transform. And then, human reflection arises. What does a civilization need to understand in order to build not just with matter, but with consciousness itself? Today, we measure the world in particles, masses, energies, but the ancients seemed to measure it in sensations, frequencies, correspondences. Perhaps for them, stone, light, and sound were just different forms of the same sacred principle, and maybe that's why so many ruins' profound insights provoke in us a strange recognition. It is not just the intellect that responds, but the spirit, as if something very old in us was reactivated. This is where the unexpected twist comes in. Researchers report finding patterns, geometric patterns that are repeated in structures separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. Hexagons, spirals, angles of 33 degree, 72 degree, 108 degrees. Not symbols decorative, recurring matrices. Some of these patterns coincide with proportions of the nature, others with constellations and positions that do not belong to the current sky, but to the firmament of remote ages. It is as if these constructions were, at the same time, temples, instruments, and maps. Maps not just of the physical world, but of the relationship between the human and the cosmos. The emotional synthesis here is serene and unsettling. Perhaps these structures are testimonies of a time when humanity did not see itself as separate from the universe but integrated into it, where every building was a stone prayer, every tunnel a mantra, each room a mirror of one's own soul. And this suggests something profound. The technology of this age forgotten may have been less about machines and more about consciousness, less about tools, more about tuning, less about strength, more about understanding. If something inside you opens up when you hear this, Know that you are not alone. Many feel this same vibration, as if the memory of this silent language was dormant within all of us, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And so we come to the hook that pushes us towards the next layer. If these ruins are in fact messages left for a future age, it will be that we are the generation destined to understand them. And what will happen when can we finally decipher the language of the stone? When we carefully analyze these buried structures, a pattern uncomfortable begins to repeat itself. Many of the civilizations we find in records, historical figures, were not, in fact, the original builders of the ruins that we attribute to them. They were heirs, accidental guardians of a legacy they didn't understand completely. This is the first major revelation of this block. There are sites in the world where the culture that occupied the space arrived thousands of years after the foundations were already there. Scientific interpretation tries to explain this with terms like cultural reuse or sequential occupation. But these elegant expressions hide a simple truth. We find civilizations living on much older structures without knowing how were created. Perfect walls with giant blocks are surrounded by houses rudimentary. Precisely cut temples coexist with clay villages. People who are bad dominated metal, inhabited remnants of impossible engineering. This disparity temporal suggests that something much greater preceded what we know. A people who dominated not only matter, but the harmony between matter, mind, and cosmos. Emotionally, this perception touches something deep within us, the intuition that we are a continuity, not a beginning, a lineage that stretches back far beyond of what they told us. And suddenly, that feeling of déjà vu that some people get when visiting ancient ruins, it starts to make sense. It's not just nostalgia, it's recognition, as if our most remote ancestors had left signs there, hoping that one day we would return not physically, but inwardly, awakening something asleep. The human reflection that arises is inevitable. Why would a civilization capable of such extraordinary feats disappear? Complete? And even more so, why later civilizations would have found these places intact but inaccessible in knowledge? This leads us to the idea that the forgotten era may not to have fallen by decadence, but by choice. Perhaps they realized that their own wisdom had become dangerous without corresponding spiritual maturity. Maybe they have decided to disappear, or retreat, to the earth itself, leaving only fragments to that future generations would encounter when they were ready to understand. The turning point comes when we look at archaeological patterns. Many of the civilizations that inherited these sites tried to imitate them. They made smaller walls copying the style of colossal blocks. They reproduced temples with simple techniques, as if they were trying to desperately replicating something they saw but didn't understand. This phenomenon is found in Egypt, South America, Asia, and distant islands in the Pacific Ocean. A question arises. How can people be so different, separated by seas and centuries, would try to reproduce the same shapes, the same patterns, and the same astronomical alignments? The emotional synthesis of this block emerges like an ancient whisper. Perhaps the forgotten era was so vast that its influence echoed for millennia, even after its fall. Echoed in myths, in oral traditions, in sacred dreams transmitted by shamans, priests, and wise. It's echoed in the way we look to the sky for answers. Because deep down, we all know that this story doesn't start with us. It starts much earlier, with a people who spoke to the universe as equals. If you feel an inner calling as you go through this narrative, trust. There are memories that are not in the mind but in the soul, and so I leave the hook that opens the next portal. If so many civilizations inherited ruins from a previous people, where are the traces direct from this primordial era, and what kind of conscience guided those who built the impossible? As we descend further down the spiral of buried ages, a theme emerges that few dare to touch: the constant presence of figures, institutions, and groups that seem operate as guardians of this forgotten knowledge. Not guardians in the sense romantic, but in the sense of administrators of access, curators of what may or may not come to the light. This is the first revelation of this block. Not everything remains hidden by time. Much remains hidden by human choice. When excavations reveal chambers that should not exist, or artifacts that contradict academic textbooks, the reaction is rarely enthusiasm. It is often containment. We see teams replaced, coordinators removed, financing frozen, reports withheld, always for apparently technical reasons, always with bureaucratic explanations. But, behind these formal layers, a question echoes unsettling. What exactly are they trying to prevent us from seeing? In emotional terms, this perception affects something deep within us, the feeling that the truth always meets resistance, as if, in each era, there was a type of ancestral fear, the fear of confronting the unknown, the fear of admitting that the basis upon which we build our collective identity may need to be revised, the fear that history is bigger, broader, more mysterious than we were taught. This fear is not new. It has accompanied humanity since we started naming stars and described gods. Human reflection here is inevitable. Why do we so fear the idea that there was something before us? Perhaps because in recognizing this, we are invited to look at our own place in the world, and realize how much we are still learning. Maybe we don't want to give up the comfort of believing that we are at the top of evolution. Maybe it's easier to ignore the eras that preceded us than to admit that we are just one of many pages of a much older book. And this is where the turning point happens. Some discoveries were not simply hidden, were reinterpreted, rewritten, molded to fit accepted narratives. Standards geometric are called chants. Impossible cuts are attributed to ritual practices. Structures aligned with constellations are reduced to coincidences. When the explanation it does not fit into reality, reality adjusts to the explanation. And this movement reveals something profound about our time. We are more afraid of truth than of mystery. The emotional synthesis of this block is revealing. Perhaps these guardians are not enemies but reflections of our own collective hesitation. They represent part of humanity who is not yet ready to admit that the past is a deep abyss, spiritual and scientific. Because if we accept this, we are forced to re-examine everything, our origin to our purpose. And that may be too transformative for some. But there is another side, the side of those who keep searching, digging, asking. Independent researchers who, even behind closed doors, persist. Travelers who describe impossible sensations inside ancient chambers. Ordinary people who, when visiting ruins, feel tears for no reason. They all do part of a silent, almost intuitive movement, the movement of remembering. If something inside you vibrates with this idea, know that it is not imagination. It's harmony. When the soul recognizes an ancient calling, it responds. And so I leave the hook for the next block. If there are guardians protecting the past, who then was protecting the knowledge in the time of the forgotten era itself? And what kind of wisdom was so powerful that needed to be divided, hidden, and buried to cross millennia? As we approach the core of these buried ruins, something begins to change in the atmosphere of the narrative. We are no longer just faced with physical structures, nor just before echoes of knowledge. We are faced with an intention, one direction, one purpose that seems to cross millennia like a golden thread, guiding those willing to see beyond the dust. The first revelation of this block is silent but powerful. The forgotten era was not just a historical period, it was a state of consciousness. Everywhere these deeper ruins appear, we find signs that its builders lived not apart from nature or the cosmos, but in alignment completely with them. They did not build to dominate the land, but to participate in it. They didn't lift temples to reach the divine, but to mirror the divine already present within oneself. There are marks of this perception in each fitted block, in each oriented corridor, in each chamber designed to amplify specific frequencies. They seem to understand that the universe was not something external, but an extension of the human being himself. Emotionally, this perception causes in us a type of longing that we do not know name, a nostalgia for something that we have never experienced consciously, but that vibrates inside us like a sleeping memory. It's like recognizing a distant scent, a music without origin, a memory without time. The soul seems to whisper, "One day you will, I knew that." And in that instant, we understand that the knowledge of the forgotten era was not completely lost. It was just veiled, waiting for the right moment to be remembered. Human reflection here intensifies. If this civilization achieved so much harmony, so much precision, so much wisdom, what could have made it disappear? There are no signs, lights of war in many of these places. There is no massive destruction, There are no traces evident conflicts. On the contrary, there are signs of gradual abandonment, as if their inhabitants had left consciously, not forcedly. This leads us to a hypothesis disconcerting. Perhaps the fall was not a catastrophe but a transition. Maybe understood that the cycle was closing, and that their knowledge needed be preserved in a less accessible form until humanity was once again ready to understand it. And here comes the turning point. Several ancient traditions, from different continents, cultures without contact with each other, talk about a golden age, followed by great oblivion. They talk about people who descended, then ascended, leaving behind only impossible stones and fragmented myths. They talk about cosmic cycles, ages of light followed by ages of shadow, as if humanity's own consciousness breathed in waves. When we compare these narratives, we realize that they are not isolated stories, are scattered memories which together form a mosaic of a much more deep. The emotional synthesis of this block is revealing. Perhaps the forgotten era has not fallen. Maybe it was saved, sealed in stone, in symbol, in myth, not out of fear but for wisdom, because knowledge without maturity becomes destruction. And those ancients knew this. Perhaps they physically disappeared so that their legacy could survive spiritually, awaiting a humanity capable of using it with responsibility. If something inside you feels like this story is more familiar than it should be, allow yourself hear that call. Sometimes the soul recognizes truths that the mind has not yet understand, and so, we pave the way for the last step of the journey. If we are once again on the verge of remembering that era, what does that mean for the future of humanity? And what awakens when a buried story finally returned to the light? We have reached the end of the journey, or perhaps the beginning of something we cannot name, because as we cross ruins that whisper buried stories, we realize that we've only been looking at the past. We were looking at ourselves. Each impossible stone, every sealed door, every corridor that seemed to breathe said, silently, the same sentence. You have already been more than you remember being. And this is where the final revelation presents itself, not as an announcement, but as a gesture smooth. The forgotten era is not lost. It lives within every intuition that makes us question, within each shiver we feel in the face of mystery, within each silence that touches us without explanation. Perhaps these ruins survive not to prove something to the world, but to awaken something in us, a memory that does not belong to the mind but to the soul. Reflect for a moment. If so many civilizations inherited traces of previous wisdom, and if we are now rediscovering these marks, wouldn't this be the time when the cycle opens again? Perhaps humanity is once again facing a portal, not a stone, but of conscience, and going through it means remembering that science and spirit, they were never opposites, but two sides of the same light. There is a silent invitation here, a calling that does not require haste, just presence. One invitation to keep searching, keep listening, keep making space for the mystery. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be remembering the path. And so, before the silence envelops us again, I leave you with one last question, no to be answered now, but to be felt throughout the days. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that is awakening, slowly, within the heart of humanity?